behavior. And as always, the same question, which is really just to open the table. It doesn't have to be about the readings this week, although I would prefer we not look ahead. Let's look backward or at today's. And what stood out to you, or what questions do you have, or are there bits of this that like didn't seem to make sense, or parts that you took to mean something different? I mean, what is the text doing for you is the real question. Lila, you're up first.
Yeah, okay, so looking back, Mike, if you could talk just a tiny bit about the Noahic covenant and how does that kind of go through the rest of the Torah, and what does it mean for me? Now, I kind of like it because it's not exclusive.
Yeah, it's an interesting covenant. And so basically what we've discovered in shouldn't pretend like I'm involved in this, but what archaeologists and like Hebrew Bible people have discovered, right, is that there's multiple kinds of covenants. And this is the kind that's like called a Suzerainty Covenant. I'll put that in the chat so you can see the spelling. And basically a suzerain is sort of like a petty feudal lord. And then there's vassals or serfs. And so there's a way that the Suzerainty Covenant can sort of work. And it sounds like this: I am the Lord. Therefore, you will do this, or I will do this. In a Suzerainty Covenant, there may not be any expectation of what people do in return. And when you read the covenant with Noah, right, it's just a proclamation. I won't destroy the world with chaos, like it says water, but with chaos again. And we talked about this, right? I'm going to give you a symbol of that. Like anytime I start shooting with my rainbow, I'm going to put it down. So shots will still be fired, but not fatally. I mean, I think that's kind of what it means. Now, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for us? I think really it's a covenant that is modeling irreparable global destruction. And so I don't want to sound crazy, but like a modern equivalent would be nuclear disarmament. Like we are committing, we will not destroy the world with our weapons.
Thank you.
How does that play out at the personal level? I think it's like this fundamental commitment to come back to, like when there's conflict in any relationship, it would be interesting to have a commitment we will not destroy the relationship. And there's this really strange prayer, Lila, in the Book of Common Prayer. It says, Almighty God, in whose peaceful kingdom no sword is wielded, but the sword of righteousness. And it's really interesting to think about weapons of production instead of weapons of destruction. The best I can do with that idea, right, is that some violence is creative and some violence is destructive. Creative violence, again, is like giving birth. It's extremely violent and it's creative when it goes according to plan. I mean, caveats are really, really important. So, thinking about weapons of construction, and this is probably like what the prophet Isaiah has in mind with taking spears and turning them into pruning hooks. There's a group that came to clergy conference. This is something I love about Mennonites. They're a little bit more extreme than I am, but like for the good. And like the Mennonites, of course, are like total pacifists. And we had this speaker come to clergy conference called Shane Claiborne, and he was sort of talking about the anti-gun business, which is interesting because many clergy in the diocese are very like pro-gun. I want you to know that. Like even concealed weapons, like if it were up to them, they would be packing on Sundays. I know this sounds crazy. By the way, the bishop said, no, you can't do that. But this guy, what he's done with Mennonites is taken, like there's like a program where you bring your gun in and they turn it into a hoe. And I mean, really, like it's like a machine gun and they put a spade at the end. So people are like hoeing with machine guns. I know that's and of course that's art. You can say it's silly, but it's really living into the story. yeah, it's like, in some ways it's really silly. And I think it's actually like a really kind of interesting reflection on that Noachic covenant. Lila, I think you're on mute still.
Can you hear me?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike.
Okay.
That was more than really good.
Yeah, I'm afraid it was more than you wanted, but.
Thank you.
That actually was very insightful for me.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I hope if I can say one other thing, it's really interesting to think about. And I read that Gandhi said this. You know, Gandhi, of course, ended up being a pacifist, but in a different way, right? Like he sort of was a pioneer in nonviolent social protest, which is a little different from pacifism, right? Because people didn't just stay in their homes and submit. I mean, they went out and they showed up. Like they lined up in formation, but they had flowers. I know that it's completely laughable, but they did that, right? And ultimately that won the day, right? And you all probably know that inspired Martin Luther King Jr. to do what he did on particularly the walk from Selma to Birmingham. But Gandhi wrote that he didn't want pacifists, actually. In fact, he said, you can't really convert to this different way of nonviolent social protest until you get mad as hell and willing to fight about it first. He actually talks about a process. And what I think is hopeful, right? I don't want to pretend like, hey, God gets really mad and starts to blow up the world and then remembers and quits. That's very like human speak. But actually, if you think about what that story suggests, it is very descriptive of what Gandhi said is a process you kind of, in Gandhi's opinion, you have to go through. Like you can't just make a jump from what you're used to this other. There's a process in which you ultimately discover this won't work for the world unless we do something different. And if you know anything about moral development theory by Larry Kohlberg, it says the same thing. Like you can't start with the golden rule, because the way we are formed in our identity is you really do think about me first. You know many adults that never made it past stage one. So you don't have to make it past the stage one, but you start there. What's curious, right, is to read Kohlberg's student Carol Gilligan, who does a feminist redo. And Gilligan says actually most women skip the what's in it for me, so that as a woman, the final stage is where you go to the golden rule, but then you come back to yourself because you never made room for yourself. But it's not that you go and park there, it's that you integrate all of that together. And that's really interesting. Kohlberg actually was very excited about that, although Gilligan chose to disown him. It's kind of a sad story. He actually was a really big fan of her work, but she kind of said, like, to hell with you, Larry. Anyway, so what I want to say is there's an interesting way of reading scripture as a reflection of all of these other principles like that we're figuring out. And that instead of saying like, oh, like God gets angry and God has bad feelings and God has temper tantrums, it's a way of saying like, actually, we find ourselves doing that and there's another way out of that. I mean, I think that's a really interesting way, is like divine modeling. You don't skip the feelings. It's what do you do when you have the feelings? You put the bow down. That was probably really more than you wanted there.
So shall we go to the Abraham story then?
We go wherever you want.
Yeah, that'd be good, because Abraham hears voices and he leaves the beautiful Fertile Crescent to wander down to some horrible desert where they almost starve and have to go to Egypt. It's a strange beginning for a religion, Mike.
It's real strange. I hope you enjoyed reading the story from the Quran about Abraham's father, the idol maker.
No, is that Terah?
Yeah, you must have missed it. I think it probably came out on Thursday or Friday. This is a story in both Jewish Midrash and in the Quran that Terah made idols. And one day he left the idol shop to go get lunch, and Abram broke all the idols except for one. And he put a stick in that one's hands. And Terah comes back and is like, I left you in charge. What happened? And Abram points at that one and says, he did it. And according to the Quran, that's when God looked at Abraham and said, like, I can work with this guy.
So are you saying that the story in the Quran is much different than it is in the Bible?
No, it's an addition. We don't have that story in the Bible. Like, that's like a scene before the call of Abram. Basically, what the Quran says is when Abram does this, God realizes that Abram will be receptive to God's call to do something different. And Lila, it's a really, like you say, it's really interesting to leave, and particularly because Lot gets the fertile part of the Jordan. Lot gets the Jordan Valley, which some of us have been there. The Jordan Valley's like nice. It's green, it's pretty, the water is cool. If you ever want to renew your baptismal vows, it's there, that's lovely. Abram doesn't get that. Lot gets all that. Abram, yeah, he gets like inland San Diego. Be under no mystery. San Diego's nice on the coast. East County is, well, it's East County. And if you've ever been out to mission trails, you get a good image of like what it looked like before things like irrigation. And P.S., that's exactly what Israel looks like without irrigation. I know Darlene's been there at a minimum. When you go to Mission Trails Park or you go to Coles Mountain, I don't see what all the sticker warfare is over here. It's all about the coast.
Yeah, you know, that is one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, Kevin, go ahead.
That is one thing that always amazes me is Israel is not, the land is just not that great. It takes a heck of a lot of work to get much out of it relative to other places at the same time. So why there? That's always kind of struck me as it would have made perfect sense if where they were fighting over was an incredibly verdant location. As opposed to a place that was really hard to make any kind of a living at?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Kevin. And I will say this, having been to Israel in March, and again, the group that went with me, the Sea of Galilee is like the Emerald Isle. I mean, doesn't that sound right, Susan, John, and Ellen, and Kathy and Lewis? I mean, it is green and wonderful. And we went to, when we were in Jordan, we went to the Golan Heights. I know it's real contentious, but if you go there, you'll see why. I mean, the Golan Heights are amazing. Like, they are so beautiful. And again, the Jordan River Valley is actually really nice. Really nice. It's just that there's a whole lot of desert otherwise. Why is a really good question. And I didn't think about this until you asked, but you know, like, think through that. A lot of Genesis is written about people who are in Babylon, far from home, coming home. And here's a story about a guy in Babylon. That's where Abram starts, going to that land. I mean, it's in some ways, it's a mirror story. And if we're really honest about it, it's because the area in Mesopotamia has already been claimed for other gods. And something we don't realize when we read the scriptures is that in the ancient Near East, deities were regional. And this even shows up in scripture, like there's the gods of the Egyptians, but their territory ends at Egypt. They don't have power outside of Egypt. And so there's this sort of like presence in Canaan, and that's part of the story. And like you say, it's interesting, like, why would you pick this land? And I think the story is saying, like, we didn't pick this land. And here's the proof we didn't pick it. We would have picked better land. And that's how we know God called this, because it's this land. That's an interesting, that's an interesting read, I want to suggest. I will say, though, in terms of like geographic diversity, Israel is extremely beautiful. I mean, it's 4 different terrains squeezed in really tight from east to west and north to south. It's sort of like New Zealand, like you get it all in a really small area, just compacted in. And particularly when you look at what the modern Israelis have done with irrigation, they really have taken, I mean, the kibbutz movement really did like make an oasis of the desert. Rhonda?
When we were in Jordan at the place where Moses looked across the
Mount
valley,
Nebo. Yeah.
And I felt like that monument there, it was full of flowering bushes and there were bees everywhere.
Yeah.
And it made me think of the land of milk and honey. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I've in that book, The Source, I think, there's a period where maybe the Muslims come in and they don't like the trees and they cut down a lot of trees. So I don't know if that's real or not, but maybe 3,000 years ago, it was much greener.
There were more trees for certain. And the thing that we miss, right, is like there were lions there and there aren't now. And part of that has to do with Roman gladiatorial games. Mm-hmm. But really, the Middle East apparently was a lot like the Serengeti. Antha, I think I saw you.
I was just wondering, I think following what Rhonda was saying, 3,000 years ago, you know, a lot of regions of our planet have changed, and was it greener and more fertile back at the era this occurred?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think like some of that and then some of not that. I think, you know, it's important to realize the desert was the desert. and the word in Hebrew is like the word midbar, and it doesn't actually mean desert like Sahara. It means like the wild place. And I do think San Diego is good to keep in mind of like that kind of scrubby desert. And what is interesting about Israel, coming back to it, is that like if you had water, you really could transform the whole thing, because most of us know California is really, really fertile if you have water. And it has to do with the soil. So if you got water, you can do a lot there, which is partly why water is such a prominent symbol of chaos. When it's there, it's great, unless you get too much of it or too little of it. Darlene, I know you were ready.
Yes, but that would take us back to the
Let's go back
thing. Okay. One of the things that I really like about that story is that God saw potential in Abram. Abram wasn't a believer. He just saw the potential in Abram to be a believer. He was open. God saw that his thinking was open. And that kind of goes back to the Buddhist concept of a beginner's mind, not having ideas solidified so much that we're not open to new ways of thinking, to new ways of believing. To me, that's real hopeful for me. and for others who are questioning, or who, and it goes back to that phrase, that prayer, please heal my unbelief.
Mm-hmm.
There's a willingness there to learn and to grow and to believe something different.
And if I can give a slightly different spin on it too, one way we hear it is Abraham was special and that's why God picked him. But another way to hear it is God had been doing this and Abraham was the first person to say yes. So what if God had done this to every single person for generations and Abraham was just the first one? There's a really wonderful thought about Virgin Mary like that too, I've heard, right? Like, hey, Mary wasn't the first one God asked. Mary was the first one that said, okay. And it took that long before somebody would say, okay, to such an insane proposition of having an out of wedlock child.
I wanted to pipe in a little bit about that. I think that it's been so refreshing doing this Genesis study this way. I had done, before my son was born, I had done a full year Bible study on Genesis, and kind of it went here and there to other places, but it's just different. But also so many things are similar. One of the things that was helpful for me in the past, but also now reading this story with Abram and Sarai, who becomes Sarah, and Hagar and Lot and Noah and his kids, and is, there's one way to look at it as this is a figurative description, a story that sets a story of how this became. But then there's the also other way of looking at it is what, that God has made each of us incredibly whole, has already accepted us as his children. And it's us reaching up to him that is the cognition and the willingness that comes to me on a day-to-day basis. So where is this story talking to me about how I behave like Abram? Where is it talking to me about how I behave like Sarah? And where is it talking to me about how I behave like Hagar? It's coming up for me. I'm looking a lot at the last couple of days that your commentary, Mike, about Sarai before she, I guess, is Sarah, and Hagar, and the difference in the perspective. Because I've been looking at, where in my life did I behave like Sarah? But I'm also looking at how I have been like Hagar, and how does that translate into how I can help others? Because the truth is that we are all in a way born like Hagar. We don't have a choice of what parents we come into, what land we land in. Maybe our beliefs, maybe my belief system as a little kid that I created in my head, I'm being told to believe something different. I have to learn it. It's foreign. There's all these things. And yet, over time, where in my life today am I still processing the remnants of being the slave master, of being the person who, because I have some kind of power over someone else, that I am trying to control them or hurt them. And that's just a very small perspective, when we translate that out, as you've been helping us do with your commentary, into the, how is it that I, with my neighbors, with the homeless guy that lives under the bridge, with the refugees that are here, how can I be a better believer and Christian and be Christ to them, because I can relate to that. I don't know. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I do think, I hope you saw it on Thursday too. Like, there's always this opportunity to even, for me to continue to learn from the story. I like to think I'm like, in some ways a liberated guy, but it's really important to remember, right? Like even in a story about Sarah, right? I mean, she's in a double bind. And I can say like, well, look, at 60, is she really, you know, does Abram really need to be worried about this? And of course she has to be worried about that every day of her life. And sometimes we miss that sort of business. And, you know, I had this really lovely conversation through email with a lady who kind of made that point to me. And I had missed it, honestly. Like, and in some ways, it's that kind of talk that reinforces like this patriarchal stuff that we live into. So that we continue to hear, like, if we really think through the story, like what options are there for people like Sarah? And, you know, Hagar is a tough story. We've been working really hard on Wednesdays with this whole talk about shame, guilt, and forgiveness and reconciliation. And there's this really interesting difference, I think, between forgiveness, which is giving up all hope of having had a different past, and acceptance. Because in some ways, like, we can accept what's been done to us, but we can't accept it happening to any other Hagars. And like, that seems to be the important bit, is recognizing that, I mean, Sarah only has slightly more rights than Hagar, but at the end of the day, they're both second and third class citizens when there's really only one family and one world. I mean, that's the sad bit of the story. And
also, I forgot, I wanted to mention real quick before I forget, I'm sorry, my ADD is a little bit off. I apologize. That we were discussing like why this area, why they went to Israel, why this land that had to be cultivated and fought over and all this stuff. And some of the stuff that came up for me this morning when we were talking about it is that is very much like my life. You know, sometimes, you know, you start in like this beautiful Eden and you have everything provided for me. And then I go out into the real world and their life can, you know, if I can either be like, oh, I've got these financial adversities. Oh, I'm in pain. You know, this is awful. Well, God, why am I here in this awful desert? And instead, you know, this morning I'm thinking, you know, oh, thank you, God. What are you teaching me here? And maybe that's part of where God is landing the Israelites is, you know, if you trust in me, everything will work out. And over time, my faith builds that.
Yeah, and I do think there's the opportunity, like you're saying, to think about the story figuratively about greening the desert. That really is a lovely thought. And the question is whether we can do that sustainably or like we irreparably drain this underground lake. You know, I mean, because by the way, that's happening. So it's sort of interesting to think about. Yeah. Antha, please.
So back to Sarah and Hagar and Sarah's story as a whole. You know, Sarah, after kind of being traded to Pharaoh in return for Abram's protection and wealth, ends up also, you know, being kind of the victim on one part of the cycle, ends up being being complicit in another part of the cycle with Hagar. And that makes me think she, you know, the womanists, you know, really take that towards, you know, that she should have treated her like a sister. You know, she should have, you know, completely understood Hagar's position and treated her, you know, much more fairly and kindly and more as a member of the family. And it makes me wonder, you know, was she so trapped in this system that they lived in, this bigger picture that you often talk about, that she didn't have the imagination to see that as a possibility? And that makes me wonder now, today, what are we trapped in that we don't have the imagination to see that there's a better way of living than the way we are now?
I think it's a really great question. Yeah, and again, for those of you who don't know, a womanist is a Black feminist. And womanist theology is very different from feminist theology because they say, right, that even though white women are discriminated against, not like Black women are. So it's a very, very different perspective. And womanist understandings of like the cross and atonement are very different from feminist ones. They're not meant to be adversarial. What they're meant to be is corrective. And I think that's really, really important. And I realized something that happened in myself. I don't know, recently. I was hearing somebody say something like, you know, as a woman, I find this really, really awful. And I have this inner voice that wants to say, okay, but let's do something constructive. And I realize how much I want to tone police. And it's so sad. I mean, I remember learning about womanist theology and thinking like, well, you could choose to be mad about everything, but that's not helpful. And again, that's just white male privilege tone policing. And so there is like this really important thing when we read these stories to say like, okay, like I have that feeling and now I'm still going to choose to be quiet and listen. Because I think there is something really important, which is if we're going to build something that's more sustainable, we could try to remodel what we have, but there probably needs to be some deconstruction actually, and some excavation and a new foundation laid. And these stories, I think, can be really positively foundational if we do what you're talking about, Antha.
Yeah, so following up that, oh boy, the train just left the station.
It's my spiritual gift.
It was there. All right, I've drawn a blank.
Come back when you're ready. It's just totally fine. Darlene, please.
But the anger is helpful. I think we have to feel the anger first, because that's a natural reaction to being violated or being negated. But we have to deal with that anger in a constructive way to move beyond the anger, or to use the anger to motivate us to make changes.
Yeah.
And we move a little, we have to keep a little bit of the anger to keep us going against the forces that tell us to be quiet and not to be angry, because that's not ladylike. We can learn to express our anger in a less threatening way in order to make some changes.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And if you're interested, Harriet Lerner's written a book about women and anger, and there's a couple other ones, right? Like Rage Becomes Her. That's an interesting thought, right? That women's anger is very suppressed. But, you know, it's interesting to think that I had a really great family therapist once who said, you know, we talk a lot about anger, but anger is like not a real feeling. It's like a dumping ground for like, I'm like jacked up and I don't know what to do with it, sort of like anxiety. And of course, what anger is like a physiological response that if we could like use those chemicals to do some deep excavating and construction, it'd be really helpful. Like adrenaline, cortisol, you can do a lot with those physiologically, for worse or for better. And the question is to take that and make the appropriate turns while not requiring everybody always be positive. I mean, I think that's the difficult thing when we think about moving post-colonial. Kat, there was an interesting question in the chat, like, hey, doesn't Hagar sort of do the same thing as Sarai once she has a child? And, you know, it's really interesting to wonder about that because the text isn't really clear. Hagar has a child. Maybe she says, look, I am more valuable now. And Sarah doesn't like that because it's upset the pecking order. And again, it would be really easy for me to say, that's Sarah, what a jerk. I mean, everybody is trying to like jockey for position because there's not enough to go around. And what are they both supposed to do? I mean, let's just be really clear. Abraham rapes this woman. You may say, oh, he doesn't hold her down. It's statutory. She has no choice, none. We sometimes get into all of this business and we say, well, there's degrees of rape. I don't know about that. When people don't have power and they can't give consent, that's the definition of rape. So like the whole Monica Lewinsky thing, hey, maybe she was willing. It was an unequal relationship with power. It's statutory rape, period. Same thing with David and Bathsheba. It doesn't matter what she was doing. She had no agency in the story. The man was a rapist. I mean, that's important for us to label. And that's always wrong, always. And I want to make a tie here because I've got a lot of brothers and sisters in the Lord who I really appreciate, who get all bent out of shape about same-sex relationships. And what I don't understand is when those are consensual relationships, right? Why we're more worried about that than we are about child abuse or female genital mutilation. Why would we rather be under an African bishop where there's polygamy and female genital mutilation than blessing consenting same-sex relationships that are based on equal positions of power? It's mind-blowing to me, the justice of that. I don't think I pulled that out of a hat, by the way. I think that's in the story. Antha?
Yeah, so going back to what Darlene said, and the train came back. I wonder if we're meant to be angry with these stories, that they're not proscriptive, this is how it should be, like you often say, but descriptive, this is how it was, and we're supposed to see them and say, wow, that was wrong. There's a better way to live, and to kind of come to that realization ourselves that there's a better way to live, and we should pursue it.
I mean, I'll tell you, our Jewish brothers and sisters read the scriptures that way. So why we've lost that ability to read, I have no idea. Maybe because it's threatening and it's ambiguous, but I think, like you say, it's hopeful. I mean, these are there are so many cautionary tales in Genesis, so many. Yeah. And we do this weird stuff, right? I mean, I can't tell you, like recently somebody was emailing me about how wonderful Melchizedek is. I mean, that guy's an idolater. He's not the Lord. He's a pagan priest. The story is crazy. Kevin, you want to do something different, hopefully.
Well, not terribly different, just rolling back to whenever I read the story about Sarai and Hagar, it seems to echo what some of us deal with in our own lives, is we're afraid of losing what little we have in order to create a larger goodness for everyone around us. I have a little bit of privilege over this other person, or maybe a lot, and rather than risk losing that privileged position, I don't open up so that they can even have basic decency. That seems to play. I mean, we have it now, and I think it's again a good cautionary tale, and probably a great way to read this.
Yeah, and I think it really gets to like what's helpful when we think about white privilege. It's not about guilt, it's about opportunity. None of us asked for the privilege, but since we have it, how can we use it in a way that's beneficial? To me, that seems like a really, really important question. Should it be the way it is? Of course not, but since it is, how do we use what we have? Was it new to hear, let me just ask, was it new to hear about the institution of temple worship? For those of you who read that, that's going back to the King of Righteousness, Melchizedek. Or to hear that Jerusalem doesn't really mean city of peace. Or Bethlehem is not really the house of bread. I don't know if that's helpful to hear.
So about Melchizedek, Mike,
Yeah.
really interesting character, and he comes up later in the New Testament, right? And so I've got the RSV.
Good for you.
Thank you. King of Salem and priest of the God Most High.
El Elyon. Yeah, El Elyon.
Who? Oh, a different one.
Well, that's the name. God Most High is El Elyon.
Okay.
Let me write it for you. So in the Canaanite pantheon, the king of the Canaanite pantheon is the god El, and Baal or Baal is another deity, Lord of the Storm. And then there's Anat, his sister, the virgin warrior. But El is sort of like Brahma in the Hindu story, like the God Most High, albeit not super active in the world. If you know if you know anything about Hinduism, that's sort of the analogy.
Oh, not too much, but
okay.
So what I've got here in the RSV is Abraham has sworn to the Lord God Most High, the same guy.
That's right.
So that's confusing to me. That confused me because I thought that they were interacting with the same God, Abraham's God, but it's not. And this Salem becomes Jerusalem, and they become Jebusites, the Melchizedek bunch. Is that right? Is this the origin of the Jebusites that David takes up with and builds the temple?
The Jebusites are the Canaanite indigenous tribe that controls Bethlehem and Jerusalem until King David conquers Jerusalem, takes it away from them. And they are people who worship El Elyon, among other gods, right? Like Salim. And they worship those gods in houses or in temples.
So Salim was a god, not a place.
Absolutely.
Oh,
so when you hear the word, so there's a couple of these different Jebusite deities, right? One of them is called Laham. In Hebrew, the word lechem is bread. So Bethlehem is the house of bread, but it's a Jebusite city before it's a Hebrew one, and it's the house of the god Laham. That's the origin of the word. And Jerusalem in Hebrew means the city of peace, but in Jebusite, it means the city of Salim, the god.
Okay. So Abraham is acknowledging that this God, Melchizedek's God, is kind of in authority right there in that little region. I was confused. What is going on here?
Yeah, this is really a tough one. There's a lot of different options. So first, let me introduce this term called syncretism. It's spelled with a Y, like in sync. Syncretism is when you encounter a different religious group or practice and you sweep it into your own.
Like rap.
Like the rosary, right? The rosary was not a Christian idea. It was a Muslim idea. And before that, it was a Buddhist idea. Bead counting, right? The Christians encountered that when they went to the Holy Land. They said, that's a cool thing. Let's do that. I don't know if you know this, but when you go to the Kaaba as a Muslim, you circumambulate the Kaaba 7 times. They got that idea from what Christians were doing at the Holy Sepulchre, because if you've been to the Holy Sepulchre, you realize it was on a hill. Constantine carved down the whole hill and Christians circumambulated. So professors of religious history will tell you the Muslims saw the Christians walking around the thing and said, that's a cool thing. Let's walk around the thing. So there's some syncretism going on. And sometimes what happens in syncretism is you take the god El and look what you make. You make the word Elohim. El Elyon, the God Most High. Elohim. So it's very possible that you say, aha, that El Elyon that you're worshiping as the chief of the gods, yep, that's the one. The chief of the gods. And scholars use this word henotheism to talk about Abram. Henotheism is not monotheism. It means devotion to one God among the many. So I don't know a single Hebrew scholar that would tell you Abraham was a monotheist. They would say he's a henotheist.
So why does Paul go back and grab this?
Well, first of all, let's be really clear. Paul did not write the Epistle to the Hebrews.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Nobody knows who wrote it. And the other thing we have to remember is what the author of the Hebrews is doing is midrash. It's Hebrew midrash. And what the author's trying to do is say, look, we've got this scripture and we've got this story that frankly is kind of weird. So let's think about it figuratively and let's think about how Jesus fulfills it. We all know Jesus was not born a Kohen. By the way, if you know anybody with the last name Cohen, Kohen is the word priest in Hebrew. So people with the last name Cohen are Levites, or they're from Aaronic descent, theoretically, right? It's the Hebrew name. Jesus did not come from that tribe. The scriptures are clear, right? Matthew and Luke say Jesus is descendant from Judah, so he can't be a Kohen. And Hebrews takes that seriously and says, yeah, he's a different kind of priest. He's this priest like Melchizedek.
Thank you. Thank you.
But I do think we gloss over this because we think the temple in Jerusalem is normative. And that's because later on in Hebrew history, it becomes that, like in the Bible. But read really carefully when you get to Exodus. God tells Moses, do not build an altar out of hewn rocks. I don't live in a house. Do not build one for me. And then David does that. And God says, that's fine. Actually, if you read the story, God says to Solomon, I don't live in a house by human hands. I won't do that. And then Solomon builds one. It's a really interesting story because the temple is a violation of the Torah. Absolutely it is. But the temple is syncretism. And so are sanctuaries for us. As a kid, the church is God's house. Well, that's fine as long as we know that everywhere is God's house. And maybe the sanctuary becomes a thin place where we can be aware of that presence. But if we say there's more of it here, we're making the mistake of temple worship. John?
So I can't exactly remember how I got here, but I was reading, I've been reading parts of the Hebrew Bible. And I was reading, looking up words, and it led me to it would be chapter 2 of Kings 1. And there is a sentence in here that I wish you would consider explaining a little bit. It says, it's chapter 2, 3. Are you looking it up?
Yes.
Okay. Tell me when you get there.
1 Kings 22.
No, 1 Kings chapter 2, 3.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Yes, I'm there.
Okay, if you read it, you can explain it to me.
Oh, goodness. Observe what the Lord your God requires, walk in God's ways, and keep God's decrees and commands, God's laws and requirements as written in the law of Moses, so you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go.
Well, can I read it the way that I'm seeing it here?
Yeah, please.
3, and keep the charge of, I'm going to say it. I know you won't, but I will. And keep the charge of Yahweh, your Elohim.
Oh, let me look at that again. Because I don't have, let me see if there's a textual note on that.
To walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his ordinances and his testimonies according to that which is written in the Torah of Moshe, that you may prosper in all that you do and whatsoever you turn yourself.
Yeah, sure. I mean, all that's saying, right, is that, I mean, you know the name Elijah, right?
Yes.
This pen is terrible. That is really just saying Elijah's name. Elijah's name. The Lord, capital L-O-R-D, Hashem, is, El is the Lord. The Lord is El.
So this is God is your God?
This is saying that El, the chief of the Canaanite pantheon, El Elyon, is the Lord.
Is the Y word.
They're synonyms.
Okay.
It's a theological decision.
I just wondered why they chose to say it this way.
Yeah, that's why.
Again, this is the Hebrew Bible. So.
Yeah, no, and the decision is telling you that they're synonyms. So maybe you thought they were two different deities, but they're in fact the same.
Well, I thought my reading of it was to keep the charge of God, your Lord.
No, if you wanted to use the word Lord, like with a small d, you would use the word Adonai or the word Baal.
Okay. Oh, wow. That's pretty old stuff.
It's really old stuff, and that's what we don't recognize. It's really old stuff.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm sorry to diverse or.
It's helpful. I hope it's a helpful point for us to realize we're not often very aware of how anachronistically we read Scripture. And I'll just give you a really great example. There were no police 100 years ago. Like in Houston, there was no police force. I can't imagine there were not police because I grew up that there's police. Police are like 80 years old. Well, what happened before that? The citizen's arrest.
Try to make one of those today.
Yeah, you better not do it, by the way. It's really dangerous to you to make that arrest. I mean, you better be right. Let me say that. And you better not infringe on somebody's civil rights.
Or have a bigger gun.
Yeah, that's not going to be a good plan. I just want to warn you. But see, what I mean is, like, when I imagine the ancient world, what I typically want to do is make it like the world I live in. But it's not like that. Rhonda.
Before we go, I just wanted to add that I read an article this week about a Hebrew scholar that's kind of revisiting some fragments that were found in the 1880s.
From Deuteronomy.
Yeah. And the old fragments could be an earlier form of Deuteronomy that refers to the Moses' law, and it only includes the 10 Commandments, and all those other laws that we see in it now were added much later, so that the original Deuteronomy was just the long story, and the only commandments were the 10.
That is really neat, Rhonda. I read that, and it is a sad story in a way. But if Mike, I don't know if anybody has the link to it, it'd be great to send it around because that's a super interesting story.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, Kathy sent it to me too. So I know Kathy Delgado has it. Well, I guess I have the link because she sent it to me.
It's from the New York Times, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
You know, I want to speak to that if I can. Sometimes we get so interested in like saying like, what's the original thing? And how has that been corrupted? And, you know, I don't know if that's healthy. I think it's helpful to think about like maybe how it started and affirmatively, why did we add these layers on? And what can we do with those layers?
Mm-hmm. I was just bringing that up because what John read in Kings, talking about Moses' law.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And law is a terrible word. And this is really, really important. We read this when we read 70 Hebrew words every Christian should know, right? Law we think of as frankly very exacting. And no Jewish person translates Torah as law. It's like way of life or guidance in a positive way. Like the African proverb, God made us because God hoped we would enjoy it. And the law is like, here are some ways you could enjoy it more. So the Torah is God's gift, not God's shackle. I mean, we often hear it the really wrong way because we read it as the Old Testament instead of as the Hebrew Bible.
Mike?
Yeah, please.
I hadn't thought of it this way, but in I guess it would be this morning's reading. I'm gonna read this, and I've just found it very interesting. Hagar looks with Sarah with contempt. And is there any wonder why Sarai, rather, used Hagar's body for her own ends and then seems threatened by the very person whose dignity she used for her own ends? And my thought there is, wow, the contempt had nothing to do with I've got one-upmanship on Sarai. It's you used me and I'm mad about it.
It's a possibility. I mean, you know, that's the whole thing, is we don't ever really know. So we have to put ourselves in an imaginative spot. You know, it was really interesting that I think is a great analog. Back when, and you can think whatever you want, and I don't want to say any political commentary, but when Kamala Harris was interviewing Justice Kavanaugh during his confirmation, she asked, you know, when there was this discussion about like abortion rights specifically, Kamala Harris had asked him to name any laws restricting men's role in reproduction. And you know what his answer was? Oh, silence.
Yes.
So we continue to live this story, right? I mean, I think that's part of the deal, right? It's a crazy thing to think about, isn't it? Crazy to think about that. Was it interesting to hear about Abraham having 318 people and how that's the sum of primes? Or the ages of the patriarchs, how it's like super wacky and represents like these combinations of like squares and things. By the way, I didn't make that up. That's in like rabbinic commentary. Like they pay attention to that stuff. It's super weird, right? Is it helpful to hear that God says, I will bless you so you can be a blessing to others? It really goes with this idea, right? That Abraham wasn't special. He just was the first person who said yes, right? And so that Abraham, having heard, is invited to help other people here. Not so he can hoard stuff, but so that he can share his privilege. We're going to talk about covenants some more, but I hope the thing about covenant is interesting. Remember, they're always cut and they're never made. Oh, did we talk about covenants? How we can cut them into our faces? Did I talk about that idea? Oh, you'll see it coming up. I don't advocate, by the way, you like slaughtering a heifer when you sell your home. I'm not an advocate of that. But it is different from a contract. A covenant is different from a contract.
I think you are that in one of the readings you mentioned that Abram had gotten a group of I guess it was a lamb and
a heifer and a bird, right? And cuts them in half.
Yeah, that was interesting.
That's the ancient way of like the spit shake. You'll see the other thing that happens too, the ancient form of the pinky swear. It's not one you want to practice, I guarantee you. That comes in like a week. Yep. Hey, thank you all for tuning in. And I do want to make this valuable. So if it's not, tell me how to make it more valuable. Please, we always can go backward. I'm just hoping that this is not only like a fun new way to read, but it's also refreshing and relevant. And I'm just really grateful for this time with you, really grateful. I'll see you next week, if not before.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.